Thank you for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. We are here at the News Forum where all voices matter. As Boom and Bust continues to examine Canada's major trading partners, I'm pleased to welcome to our program the Right Honourable the Lord Hannan of Kingsclear. Daniel Hannan is a former member of the European Parliament for the UK, a writer and author, and serves currently as an advisor to the UK Board of Trade. Welcome to the program, Daniel.
Thank you, Tony. Nice to be here.
I guess first, right off the bat, would love to get your perspective on the UK, the assessment of its state of economic growth, more or less in a post-pandemic lockdown period, and maybe compare and contrast that with some other major trading partners.
It's very difficult to know because, of course, we're still in the lockdown pandemic period. But it is, I think, worth stressing that we went into the epidemic in a better condition than I think a lot of the international media recognized. And the reason for that was because, if you like, honest reporting of economics had been prejudiced by people's attitudes to Brexit. So it's worth just beginning with the facts. In 2016, in 2017, in 2018, in 2019, the UK outperformed the Eurozone. You can take any measure you like, not just the basic growth, but you could look at unemployment, at the manufacturing output, the stock exchange, the bounce back of the currency, exports, pretty much any measure you like. And we were doing very well. But that point is really worth underlining, particularly to friends overseas, because I found that a lot of the foreign media, understandably taking their cue from the Financial Times, the BBC, and The Economist, which tend to be the kind of most read UK media overseas, and particularly even more the New York Times, which has become deranged on this subject, could not bring themselves to admit that anything was going right. And as a number of sort of Remain-leaning economists have now said, this led to their profession making some huge mistakes because of tendentious reporting and results-driven surveys. So we went in to the epidemic in a better condition than most of our neighbours. Then, of course, this wrecking ball came slamming in from the side, thudded into us as it has into you and into every other country in the world. And it's very hard to know who is going to be best placed to come out of that. But we did have the first real test of what a post-EU Britain could do differently when it came to the vaccine purchase programme.
Right.
The European Union messed it up quite badly. It's not that the UK was the best in the world. We were good. We were definitely in the top kind of decile, but we were not the outliers. Really, the EU was the outlier.
Right.
It did remarkably badly compared to Canada, compared to the US. And the reason for that, it was all the stuff I was familiar with when I was in the European Parliament. The desire to make sure that every country got something, the political trade-offs. If you're going to have a German vaccine, you've got to have a French one. Oh, but the French one doesn't work. Never mind. We still got to have. All of this went on and on and on, meaning that they were very slow placing their orders. So the one thing that we've really been tested in first, I'm glad to say, a post-EU Britain is firing on all cylinders. And through a combination of acquired immunity for younger people and vaccination for older people, I've never said this before, but for the first time, I really think we're through this now. I think we're over the hill and the country is reopening.
And, there are projections that Great Britain will lead the G7 in terms of economic growth, something like a robust 6 or 7%, if I'm not mistaken. So has Brexit sort of moved more aside from the obvious, Mrs. Lincoln, has Brexit moved according to plan in your estimation?
Largely. I'll be totally honest because I don't want to be just here as a kind of booster for the UK. I mean, we suffered a slightly sharper recession at the beginning, so the growth rate partly reflects a rebound from a lower place. But even factoring that in, we are doing very well, and we're predicted to do very well relative to other developed economies. How much of this is Brexit? Well, the most uncontroversial point is that the prognostications of disaster spectacularly failed to materialize. We haven't ended up with sort of, well, I mean, we did end up with closed borders and queues of lorries in Kent, but that was not because of Brexit. That was because of the coronavirus and the subsequent lockdowns. But we are now, as we come out of it, beginning to pursue a much more liberal trade policy.
And I do want to get to that, Daniel. We're going to take a short break. Hold that thought. We'll be right back with you. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, here with Daniel Hannan. He's a former member of the European Parliament for the UK. He is now a Lord in the House of Lords, but is also an advisor to the UK Board of Trade. Daniel, thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah.
We were just about to get into a very interesting point about Britain being competitive. Perhaps you want to talk about your vision of a tax competitive and a regulation competitive UK and how that could be a model for the world.
A very important advantage for me of Brexit is that we can pursue a more liberal trade policy than when we were part of the EU's customs union. So when you're in the European Union, you don't get a trade policy. Britain has not had an independent trade policy since 1973. All of our deals were done on our behalf by Brussels. And although there was some internal liberalization within the EU, I don't deny that for a moment, it was bought at the expense of a sort of tariff wall and a regulatory wall around it, which was much more deleterious in its impact on us because we were the only EU member that sold more outside the bloc than to it. So particularly our Commonwealth trade suffered very badly in the 1970s when the external tariffs were phased in. Now, a huge advantage of Brexit is being able to undo that and re-engage with the world as a free trading country. Now, we have capacity issues. We're coming to this new after half a century. There's only so many officials in our department. I think we've actually negotiated more trade deals in a shorter time than any other country in history, but there are still constraints in terms of what we have to prioritize. So we took the view that where we inherited a perfectly serviceable deal from the EU, so where the EU already had a deal with Canada or Japan or whatever, we would say to the other party, okay, for now, let's just leave that, but we'll come back to it as soon as we can. And we then concentrated on the countries where we had no trade deal at all because the EU had no trade deal at all. So Australia, New Zealand, the United States, which is ongoing, the Gulf, Mercosur, India, which is the huge prize if we can get it. Mm-hmm. But we will then come back, and we are coming back now to Canada, among others, and saying now, where can we go further than the European Union was prepared to? We do not have the defensive interests that a lot of the heavy industries on the continent, and particularly a lot of the farming interests, placed on the table in those talks. Britain can be a much, if you like, easier trading partner. Now, we've had a very ambitious, very comprehensive trade deal signed with Australia. We are very, very close to concluding one with New Zealand. These will be state-of-the-art trade deals, very, very comprehensive, covering digital trade, intellectual property, all of it. Among the best in the world. I won't say the best. I think the Australia-New Zealand deal is probably the best in the world. We would love to draw Canada into the same kind of deal. If not immediately, then maybe in phases, right? One of the things we're doing is we're joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which at the insistence of Justin Trudeau is now given the very clunky name Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. But, you know, clunky name or not, that's where the growth is, right? And we're not a Pacific country, except in the very technical sense that we do own the Pitcairn Islands, right, which are pretty much bang in the middle of it. But we have very, very close links to Canada, to Australia, to New Zealand, and indeed to Singapore, Malaysia, and so on. So this is a very natural place for us to be. And I hope that within CPTPP, the more ambitious and more advanced economies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, UK, can go deeper. We can have like a more ambitious arrangement that nestles within the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Yeah, we've got about a minute before the break, and we'll probably tackle something else. But just on the Australia deal, you mentioned farming. Obviously, that's been a real impediment for Canada in trade deals because of the the dairy industry and so forth. So you were able to sort of get through those issues with the farming community and get a good deal.
Yes, it wasn't easy. Farmers the world over, you and I have both been elected politicians, have a clout because, understandably, people feel attached to land, and we place farming in a special mental category. But the one thing I would say is, if you want to look after Canadian dairy farmers, the way to do it is just to give them money rather than to mess up your whole trade policy and make everyone else pay the price for it.
On that note, we are going to return after a break with Daniel Hannan, talk about some more wonderful and interesting economic issues that affect the UK and Canada. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Daniel Hannan. He is a former member of the European Parliament for the United Kingdom, a writer, an author, a Lord in the House of Lords, and serves currently as an advisor to the UK Board of Trade. Daniel, I would love to get your thought. We have been talking a little bit about taxation policy and regulatory policy here. Obviously, the big push in the last G7 meeting and the OECD has been to get a common tax rate, minimum tax rate, obviously, to target big tech and other multinational enterprises. Is this a good thing in your view?
No, it's not a good thing. The best way for a poor country to stop being poor, or maybe not the best way, but an important way for a country to make itself richer as it develops, is to have competitive taxes, particularly competitive corporate taxes. And the danger of this proposal, which comes in many forms, there's an OECD version of it, there's a UN version of it, it's an idea that's been kicking around. The Biden administration obviously very keen on it. The danger of it is that it creates a high tax cartel, and it makes it very difficult for a country to grow by making itself more competitive. Look, governments need revenue. We've got to tax. No one likes paying tax, but we've got to get it from somewhere, right? But taxing, we tax things that we don't like, right? If tobacco taxes discourage smoking, and if carbon taxes discourage pollution, what do we think business taxes will do, right? If we want to encourage enterprise, this is a very bad way of going about it. And it's worth stressing, this may seem a really obvious point. It is an obvious point, but it can't be repeated too often. All taxes are paid by human beings. There is a temptation for politicians to say business taxes because that creates the impression that someone else is going to be paying it. But of course, a business is no more paying the business tax than our TV set is paying the license fee or your car is paying the petrol tax. All taxes fall on human beings. And business taxes, to the extent that they fall on suppliers and customers, are a peculiarly regressive and harmful form of tax. They discourage the stuff that we like, which is transactions and economic growth, and they encourage forms of unearned wealth. So I am strongly against this idea. I'm not saying that we shouldn't find a way of taxing tech companies. I mean, there can't be a complete exemption simply because there's a new technology, but the idea of a minimum global tax rate is only going to result in more and more taxes being harmonized.
It seems like it's an unstoppable force right now. As you said, the Biden administration has come around to it. Even the Irish government, that would be the most likely to dissent on this, is burbling that it may not be such a bad thing and they could live with it. So is this just going to happen, do you think?
I mean, I think they could probably live with what's being watered down as the first version of it. But we know that it doesn't stop there. You empower these bureaucracies. They never say, oh, job done, let's disband ourselves, right? It only ever goes in one direction. And I'm afraid that, let's be honest about this, the public mood is with more regulation. One of the very sad consequences, among many, of the lockdowns and the epidemic is that it's flicked switches in our brains. It has made us more demanding of big government. It's made us more illiberal. It's made us, if you like, readier to put up with a measure of autocratic or authoritarian rule. Because that's what happens. It's like a war, right? People just become, if you like, warier, more scared, more inward looking. And just as after 1945, we found in the UK that the state was very reluctant to return the powers which it had seized on a supposedly contingent basis during the mobilization. So I'm afraid that as the threat of the virus recedes, as it becomes an endemic seasonal virus that we live with, the appetite for big government is going to remain. And I'm afraid that the decades ahead are going to be pretty tough for those of us who believe in a small state and in free enterprise.
I mean, you could make the argument that the tide didn't start to recede in the UK until Margaret Thatcher in the very late 70s. It was that from Clement Attlee on, it was just, again, an unstoppable force. And we're facing the same thing in Canada as well.
Yeah, I think you put that very well. I mean, the victory was in 1945. We had identity cards until 1952. We had food rationing until 1954. We had full conscription until 1960. And as you say, we had the economic package that had been put in, again, supposedly for a mobilized economy up until the 1980s. Indeed, when you look at healthcare and education, we still have large elements of it today, things that were brought in wartime. And it wasn't just that the country was prepared to put up with these things. The country was demanding it.
That's right.
Right? Just as now.
We're going to have to deal with the finances of this TV station. We'll be right back with Daniel Hannan right after these commercial messages. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. We've got our final segment here with Daniel Hannan, a former member of the European Parliament for the UK, writer and author, Lord in the House of Lords, and an advisor to the UK Board of Trade. Daniel, I cut you off there for a commercial break. Please continue your thought.
It was simply to make the point that in 1945, there was this mismatch between what we could afford, which was basically very little, right? We'd exhausted our treasury, emptied and finished our credit beating Hitler, and what people felt that they had earned through the privations of war, right. Massive increase in pensions, healthcare, education, etc. And I see the same thing today across the developed world. Governments are skint. We have, again, exhausted our credit and emptied our treasuries fighting the virus and paying people to stay at home and all the rest of it. But people feel that they've earned a pay rise because they've put up with the last 16 months. And I'm afraid that's going to be a very difficult thing to negotiate for everyone who's still in elected politics.
Quite so. And if it's any solace, knowing history as it is, same in Canada, same in the UK, but after a while, government being the dour matron and saying this is what you can do and this is what you shan't do, after a while, people tire of that. So hopefully there'll be a rebound in freedom lovers in the near future.
Well, yeah, from your mouth to God's ear. I mean, so far there is precious little sign of that.
Right.
There is a general authoritarianism, people wanting, nightclubs closed and curfews and so on, not because of the virus, but just because they want them now. Right? There was a terrifying poll that showed that 19% of people in the UK thought that we should have a 10 p.m. curfew, not as a response to the coronavirus, but permanently because it was a good idea in itself. And that's, I'm afraid, the change in brain chemistry that has been wrought by the virus.
Indeed. Well, I want to ask you before we run out of time about, we've got this Council of Parties coming up, the COP meeting, the environmental meeting, Jamboree in Glasgow in the fall, in obviously Glasgow being part of the UK. So, and you have been somewhat critical of what you call unilateral decarbonization. So give me a sense of your assessment of where decarbonization or zero carbon is these days.
Yeah, somewhat critical is, I think, is exactly the right way to put it. As someone whose family origins were in Glasgow and indeed who was there last week, I'm delighted that it's happening. I believe that this will alienate some of the people watching. I believe that the planet is heating, at least in part, in response to human activity. And I think that requires a coordinated response. But we should approach the issue of rebalancing our energy demands as conservatives should approach every issue, in a hard-headed transactional spirit rather than in a virtue signaling and millenarian spirit. You've got to deal with the problem of the free riders. If China and India and Russia and Saudi and so on are not prepared to enforce any targets, that creates a context in which the rest of us are acting. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't act at all. Someone's got to go first, I get that. And you shouldn't say that no one should do anything because you've got one country holding out, but we do need to be very hard-headed about how we do it. I would just make this point, though. I think that if you like, the natural progress of the market will mean eventually a shift from fossil fuels because it will become more expensive to extract them and new technologies will become cheaper. So I think there is a valid role for government in, if you like, just pushing that process along a little bit, provided that we are proportionate and that we're not too heavy-handed.
And do you expect something gargantuan to come out of this Glasgow meeting?
Well, look, I mean, I think that the Chinese are well aware of the immediate problems that they will have if there is a substantial change in the destabilization or the heating of the planet. So it's not as though they don't recognize any responsibility at all. I think that, our Prime Minister is very charming. If there's anyone who can cajole others into making commitments that they are then incentivized to keep, I'd rather have him in my corner than a lot of the other contenders at the moment.
Daniel Hannan, I think we could have gone on for another hour and a half. We haven't even really talked about China. We haven't talked about Russia. There's more to talk about with Asia. I guess we'll have to have you back. I'm very, very happy that you were able to do this. I know it's 5 hours ahead for you, so I know you got some young ones you got to tuck into bed. So thank you very much for taking the time today.
Great pleasure to see you, my old friend, and keep it up.
All the best. Well, as usual, Lord Hannan does not hold back. A lot of interesting viewpoints on free trade, on post-Brexit Britain, on deregulation, and making sure taxes are appropriate. I'd love to have him back on, but I'm glad you were with us for this. Thanks for watching.